Millionaire invites his ex to his wedding, but she arrives with a boy who looks just like him. The New York sky was tinged golden by the setting sun as the city's most influential guests arrived at the Harrington estate, a property worthy of a fairy tale. Surrounded by impeccable gardens and filled with discreet security guards, the mansion was the ideal venue for the wedding of Sebastian Harrington and Amelia Crawford. Sebastian, the billionaire who built an empire with his own genius, was known for his calculated coolness. Amelia, on the other hand, was an icon of elegance, representing the tradition and prestige of high society. The luxury cars parked one by one, disgorging figures dressed in haute couture and adorned with glittering jewels. But in the midst of all the opulence, an ordinary cab pulled up at the main gate. When the door opened, the gazes of some nearby guests were immediately drawn to a woman with wavy brown hair who descended holding the hand of a small boy. Her dark blue dress, although simple, shaped her body perfectly, and there was something about her bearing that didn't match the simplicity of the cab. Elizabeth Donovan took a deep breath, adjusting her posture before looking at her son, Lucas. The 6-year-old seemed oblivious to the tension in his mother, his eyes shining with curiosity as he surveyed the stunning mansion in front of him. He held a small backpack with his favorite toys, as if it was the most natural thing in the world to bring them to a wedding. "Lucas, remember to stay close to me, okay?" Elizabeth whispered, but her voice trembled. The boy just nodded, shaking his head as he smiled. As they passed through the iron gates, Elizabeth felt the weight of each step. The invitation in her hand seemed to burn as if it were a trap. Why had Sebastian sent that invitation? They hadn't seen each other for years. They hadn't exchanged a single word since the night that had destroyed everything between them. Yet the invitation had arrived, with his name meticulously written on it as if it were a provocation. The trained eyes of the elite noticed her presence the moment she crossed the gardens. Whispers began, at first muffled, but soon audible. "Who is she?" "Elizabeth Donovan. They dated years ago, didn't they? And that child, my God, he looks so much like Sebastian." Elizabeth felt the flush rise to her cheeks but held her head high. Lucas, oblivious to the attention, pointed to a group of decorative birds in the garden and exclaimed enthusiastically, "Mom, look, they're so big." She smiled slightly at him, the only comfort in the midst of this internal chaos. Inside the mansion, the glow of the candles reflected off the crystal chandeliers, creating an almost unreal atmosphere. The guests circulated with glasses of champagne in hand, but Elizabeth's arrival did not go unnoticed. And when she finally found Sebastian in the ballroom, her breath caught. He was imposing in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his hair carefully combed back. He looked exactly as Elizabeth remembered, but something in his eyes had changed. When their gazes met, Sebastian froze. The glass in his hand rattled slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. Amelia stood next to him, radiant in her pearly white dress. Her posture was impeccable, and the smile on her face was a perfect picture of happiness. But when she saw Sebastian's gaze fixed on someone at the back of the room, she turned away. Elizabeth didn't move. She kept her gaze locked on Sebastian, a mixture of resentment and pain that she had never been able to completely bury. Lucas tugged on her hand, pointing again, this time to a nearby tray of sweets. "Mommy, can I have one of these?" he asked, his childish voice breaking the tension that hung in the air. Before Elizabeth could answer, Amelia approached, gently taking Sebastian's arm. "Who is she?" Her voice was low, but there was a hint of curiosity and suspicion. Sebastian took his time answering, as if he needed time to collect himself. "Elizabeth, an old acquaintance." Amelia narrowed her eyes, assessing the woman and then the boy who was now devouring a sweet with a carefree smile. "What about that boy?" Elizabeth, who had heard the question, stepped forward. "This is Lucas, my son." Her voice was firm, but her eyes carried a silent challenge as she stared at Sebastian. Sebastian quickly looked away from Lucas. His eyes, those green eyes identical to his own, stared back at him with innocent curiosity. He felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Before anything else could be said, the wedding coordinator announced that the ceremony was about to begin. Amelia pulled Sebastian into the main hall, but not before casting one last appraising glance at Elizabeth. Elizabeth and Lucas sat at the back, away from the altar. As Amelia walked down the aisle, accompanied by soft music, Sebastian couldn't help it. His eyes wandered to the back of the room, where Elizabeth was. And then, just as Amelia reached the altar, Lucas, in his innocence, raised his voice. "Mom, is that my dad?" The entire hall was plunged into dead silence. All eyes were on Sebastian, Elizabeth, and Lucas. Amelia stopped in the middle of the aisle, her eyes wide and her expression of happiness transformed into something close to shock. Sebastian knew that at that moment, his life would never be the same again. The silence in the hall was absolute, oppressive. Lucas's question hung in the air like thunder about to crash. All faces were turned towards Sebastian, Elizabeth, and the boy, who was now biting into a sweet with the serenity of a child oblivious to the chaos he had just caused. Sebastian froze at the altar, unable to form any words. Amelia, who was still holding her bouquet, felt the tension vibrate in the air. She looked at him, searching for a denial, anything to dispel the cloud of doubt that was beginning to envelop her. But what she found was a man immobilized, eyes wide and jaw clenched. Elizabeth felt the weight of dozens of stares on her, but she refused to look away. Her hand trembled slightly as she gripped Lucas's arm, but she knew she couldn't show weakness. She hadn't expected her son to ask such a direct question, but perhaps it was inevitable. Ever since they had received that invitation, a feeling had been eating her up inside. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything. Amelia stepped forward, her voice finally breaking the silence. "Sebastian, who is that child?" Her tone was sharp, although she tried to disguise her trembling. The guests stirred in their seats, some exchanging hushed whispers, while others simply stared in shock. No one dared interfere. This was a spectacle that everyone knew was dangerous, but irresistible. Sebastian let out a shaky sigh and turned to Amelia. "Amelia, I don't know what to say." Those words were like a dagger. Amelia blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. "You don't know what to say, is that it?" Her voice rose an octave, laden with disbelief. Elizabeth stood up. She knew she had to do something before the situation exploded. "I didn't come here to cause a fuss," she said, her voice firm but clearly emotional. "Sebastian sent the invitation, and I just thought I should be here to show that I don't hold grudges." "Show that you don't hold grudges?" Amelia shut up, spinning on her heels and staring at Elizabeth. "You show up at my wedding with a boy who has the same face as my fiancé, and you expect me to believe that this is a coincidence?" Lucas, still holding Elizabeth's hand, tugged at her dress. "Mum, did I do something wrong?" The sound of his innocent voice cut through the room like a blade. Elizabeth bent down to him, trying to prevent him from seeing the whirlwind around them. "No, my love, you haven't done anything wrong." Sebastian finally moved, stepping down from the altar. He looked like a different man, the weight of circumstance bowing his shoulders. When he stopped in front of Elizabeth, his gaze met Lucas. Something inside him shattered. The boy's eyes, green and intense, were a reflection of himself. He knew at that moment that he didn't need any tests or confirmations. "Elizabeth," he began, but his voice failed him. He swallowed and tried again. Is he my son?" The whole room held its breath. Elizabeth took her time before answering. Her mind was filled with painful memories of nights alone, dealing with the weight of raising Lucas without support. Finally, she raised her eyes, staring at Sebastian with something between hurt and determination. "Yes, he's your son." The impact of those words was immediate. Amelia let out a choked sound, a mixture of a scream and a sob. She dropped the bouquet, which fell to the ground like a dead flower. Sebastian took a step back, as if he had been punched. He ran his hands over his face, trying to process what he had just heard. He looked at Lucas again, who was now staring at him with the same childish curiosity as before. Why didn't you ever say anything to me?" His voice was low, but charged with emotion. Elizabeth took a step forward, and the pain in her eyes was evident. "You left me, Sebastian. You made it clear that there was no room for me in your life. I tried to tell you, but when you disappeared, when you started climbing to the top of the world, I knew I could never compete with that." "Compete?" he repeated, his voice getting louder. "You think this was a competition? Elizabeth, I deserved to know. I had a right to know that I had a son." Her eyes watered, but she didn't let the tears fall. "And I had the right not to be abandoned. I had the right to protect my son from a man who never bothered to look back. Lucas, sensing the growing tension, squeezed his mother's hand. Sebastian noticed the gesture, and his heart squeezed. For the first time, he saw what was at stake. It wasn't about the past, it wasn't about Elizabeth. It was about that boy who, without knowing it, had just exposed the truth to the world. Amelia, who was watching the scene with a broken heart, finally found the strength to speak. Her voice was low, almost inaudible, but full of anger and pain. "I've asked you so many times, Sebastian. I asked if there was something in your past that I needed to know. And you always said no. You always said that nothing mattered before me." Sebastian tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. He knew he had lied, even if unconsciously. He had buried Elizabeth and everything he felt for her in a dark corner of his mind, hoping that he would never have to deal with it again. But the past always finds a way of coming back, especially when it involves something as big as a child. Amelia took a few steps back, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this," she whispered, before turning and running out of the hall. Sebastian stood still, staring at the door through which she had disappeared, but he didn't follow. His attention was fixed on Lucas, who was now looking at him with a mixture of confusion and expectation. "Are you my father?" the boy asked again, this time directly to Sebastian. Sebastian felt tears forming in his own eyes, but he couldn't answer. He didn't know how to answer. Elizabeth bent down beside her son, putting her hands on his shoulders. "Lucas, let's go," she said, her voice broken. But before she could leave, Sebastian grabbed her arm. "Please, don't go. I need time to process this." She stared at him for a moment before pulling her arm back. 6 years, Sebastian. You've had 6 years." And with that she left, taking Lucas with her, leaving Sebastian alone in the middle of the empty hall, surrounded only by the judgmental stares of the guests. The mansion door closed behind Elizabeth and Lucas, muffling the sound of the party that was slowly returning to normal inside the hall. Outside, the air was cold and heavy. Lucas, still holding his mother's hand, looked at her with big, questioning eyes. "Mom, is he really my father?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, trying to control the emotions bubbling up inside her. The question was simple, but it carried a complexity that a 6-year-old could never understand. She knelt down so that she was at Lucas's height, holding his small shoulders gently. "Lucas, I promise I'll explain everything to you, just not now, okay? Let's go home." The boy nodded, although his gaze showed that his doubts persisted. He held Elizabeth's hand tighter, and together they started down the steps of the mansion. Behind them, the whispers of the guests echoed through the open windows, their voices full of judgment and speculation. Meanwhile, inside the hall, Sebastian remained paralyzed. His gaze was fixed on the direction in which Elizabeth and Lucas had disappeared, and his mind seemed caught up in a whirlwind. The murmurs around him no longer made sense, and all he could hear was the repetition of the words Lucas had said. "Are you my father?" "Sebastian!" The cutting voice of his mother, Margot Harrington, brought him back to reality. She approached quickly, her heels clicking against the marble floor as her face showed a mixture of anger and concern. "What was that?" Margot hissed, gripping her son's arm tightly. "The most important wedding of your life is falling apart in front of everyone, and you just stand there like a fool." Sebastian pulled his arm away, his expression hardening. "This is no time for that, Mom." "It's not the time," Margot repeated, incredulous. "Sebastian, that woman just ruined everything. Do you know what this means for our family, for the Harringtons? The scandal this will cause." "I don't care about scandals now," he retorted, his voice louder than he intended. "I have a son, Mom, a son I never knew existed." Margot froze for a moment, surprise evident on her face, but then her expression returned to its usual one, cold and calculating. "You don't know that for sure," she retorted. "That woman appeared out of nowhere with a child and is trying to take advantage of you. It's obvious that she planned it." Sebastian looked at his mother incredulously. "Did you hear what she said? Did you see his eyes? He's my son, Margot. There's no doubt about that. And what do you intend to do? Throw away your marriage to Amelia because of a woman who turns up out of the blue with a child?" Amelia's name brought an even greater weight to Sebastian's shoulders. He looked at the empty altar, where the abandoned bouquet still lay on the ground. Everything felt wrong. He had lost control of the situation, something that never happened. "I need time," he said, almost to himself. "Time?" Margot crossed her arms, annoyed. You don't have time, Sebastian. Amelia is waiting for you, and if you lose this alliance, our position will be at risk." But he wasn't listening anymore. Without another word, Sebastian turned and left the room, ignoring the curious looks and his mother's calls. Elizabeth struggled to find a cab. The few that passed along the street seemed busy, and Lucas was beginning to show signs of tiredness, yawning as he clutched his backpack to his chest. "We'll be right there, darling," she said, trying to hide the anxiety in her voice. Before she could flag down another cab, a familiar voice called out to her. "Elizabeth!" She turned and saw Sebastian hurrying down the steps of the mansion. For a moment, she considered simply walking on, but something in his expression made her stop. Sebastian stopped a few meters away, clearly out of breath. His eyes were fixed on Lucas, and there was a vulnerability in them that Elizabeth had never seen before. "Please," he began, his voice breaking. I need to talk to you." Elizabeth pressed her lips together, hesitating. Lucas looked at the man who had just met him and tugged on his mother's arm. "Mom, does he want to talk to us?" She bent down to Lucas again. "Just a moment, dear. Please wait here." Elizabeth walked over to Sebastian, keeping her voice low so Lucas couldn't hear. "What do you want, Sebastian? I've already done my bit today." "I need answers," he said, his voice almost pleading. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you keep me away from my own son?" Elizabeth crossed her arms, as if trying to protect herself from his words. "I tried, Sebastian. I tried so many times, but you left me behind. How could I compete with the world you were building?" "Don't you think I had a right to know?" he asked, the pain evident in his voice. "And you don't think I had the right to protect my son?" she retorted, her voice firm. "Lucas didn't deserve to be dragged into your life of appearances and expectations. He deserved peace." Sebastian remained silent, her words piercing him like thorns. He looked at Lucas, who was now playing with the edge of his backpack, oblivious to the weight of the conversation. "I don't want to take him away from you," Sebastian finally said, "but I want to be part of his life. Please, Elizabeth, let me do that." She hesitated. Part of her wanted to push him away forever, to protect Lucas from any complications Sebastian might bring. But the other part, the part that still remembered the man she loved, knew that to deny him, that would be to deny Lucas something important. "I'm not going to decide that now," she replied. "Do you want to be part of his life? Prove that you deserve it." Sebastian nodded, knowing he had no other choice. Elizabeth put Lucas to bed, kissing his forehead softly before turning out the lights. But while he slept peacefully, she stayed awake, sitting on the sofa in the living room, lost in thought. Across town, Sebastian was in his office, staring at a photo of Amelia, and wondering if the future he had planned could survive the maelstrom that had begun. And in a dark corner of the Harrington mansion, Margot was making a phone call. Her voice was low, but laden with determination. "We need to investigate Elizabeth Donovan. I want to know everything about her, everything." Everyone's fate was about to become even more intertwined as the past refused to stay buried and new secrets threatened to come to light. The next morning brought a grey sky, as if the universe itself echoed the chaos unfolding in Sebastian and Amelia's lives. The Harrington mansion, usually a fortress of order and elegance, was plunged into an uncomfortable silence. Sebastian had spent the night in the study, reliving every word spoken, every expression on Elizabeth's face, and above all, Lucas's innocent question. He knew he couldn't put off the inevitable. Amelia deserved an explanation, not just for the way the marriage had fallen apart, but for everything he had hidden. What had once seemed buried in the past now emerged with an uncontrollable force, threatening to destroy everything he had built. Sebastian left the mansion before his mother Margot even had the chance to question him again. He knew that his mother was plotting something, as she always did in moments of crisis, but for the time being, that was the least of his problems. Amelia was staying at the luxurious Belmont Hotel, an obvious choice for someone of her social standing. The suite she was in was spacious and bright, but the air inside was heavy. Amelia, still wearing the silk robe she had picked up from the closet, stared at the window with a lost look on her face. The city stretched out before her, but the feeling of isolation was almost suffocating. Last night had been a nightmare. She constantly relived the scene at the altar, Lucas's voice echoing through the room, Sebastian's stunned look, and, most painful of all, the absence of any denial on his part. Why hadn't he denied it? That more than anything was what tortured her. When the doorbell rang, Amelia was snapped out of her thoughts. Reluctantly, she walked to the door. She didn't need to open it to know who it was, but something inside her wanted to face Sebastian, wanted him to say something that would lighten the weight she was carrying. She opened the door and found him on the other side, looking as exhausted as she felt. His impeccable suit couldn't hide the tension on his face. "Amelia," he began, but she held up her hand, silencing him. "Come in," she said, her voice cold but controlled. Sebastian entered, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. He tried to find the right words, but Amelia's silence was almost unbearable. She finally broke the silence, her voice laden with sorrow. "Did you know?" Sebastian shook his head immediately. "No, I didn't know, Amelia. I never knew Lucas existed." She laughed bitterly, crossing her arms. "And that's supposed to make me feel better, that you have a son and didn't know it. What kind of man ignores something like that?" "I didn't," Sebastian replied, his voice louder than he had intended. He took a deep breath, trying to calm down. "I didn't know because Elizabeth never told me. And I admit it, I was a coward back then. I broke things off with her because I thought I needed to focus on my career, on what my family expected of me. I thought I was doing the right thing." Amelia looked at him with a mixture of pain and incredulity. "The right thing? You think abandoning someone you claim to love was the right thing? And now look where we are. She's back, with a boy who looks just like her, and I—" Her voice faltered, and she looked away, blinking rapidly to hold back the tears. Sebastian took a step forward, but she raised her hand again, asking for space. "Amelia, please listen to me. I never lied to you. I never knew about Lucas. And if I had, I would have done something. I'm not that kind of man." "No?" She looked at him again, this time with an intensity that made him flinch. "Because what I see now is exactly that kind of man. You promised me that nothing in your past mattered, that I was everything. And now in a single day I find out that there are secrets, lies, a son." Sebastian ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I can't change what happened, but I can try to correct the future. I don't want to lose you, Amelia." She laughed again, but this time there was sadness in her laugh. "Fix the future? How are you going to do that, Sebastian? You have a son now, a son who will be part of your life and mine if we continue together. And I don't know if I can handle it." The silence between them dragged on, every second fraught with tension. Finally, Amelia sat down in the armchair by the window, crossing her legs and looking at him. "Do you want to be part of his life?" Sebastian didn't hesitate. "Yes. He's my son, Amelia. I can't pretend he doesn't exist." She nodded slowly, as if she had expected this answer. "Then perhaps you should start there, Sebastian. Before you try to fix anything between us, you need to find out what it means to be a father. Because at the moment I don't know who you are." "Amelia." She raised her hand again, but this time with less anger. "Please, give me some space. I need to think, and so do you." Sebastian nodded, although every fiber of his being wanted to argue. He knew that insisting would only make things worse. With heavy steps, he headed for the door. Before leaving, he turned to her once more. "I love you, Amelia. That hasn't changed." She didn't reply, just looked away. He sighed and left, closing the door softly behind him. Sebastian returned to his mansion, where Margot was waiting for him with a stern look on her face. She was sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in her hands and an expression that mixed reproach and calculation. "I'm glad you're finally back," she said, her voice cutting. "Not now, Mom," Sebastian replied, taking off his coat and throwing it on the sofa. "Yes, now," Margot insisted. "You may have ruined the wedding, but that doesn't mean we're going to lose control of the situation." Sebastian turned to her, exhausted. "I'm not interested in control right now. I'm trying to do the right thing." "Right?" Margot laughed, a cold, empty sound. "What's right, Sebastian? Being manipulated by this woman and a boy who might not even be yours? Is that what you call right?" He narrowed his eyes at her. "Lucas is my son. I don't need proof to know that. So you're willing to throw everything away for that? The reputation? The legacy? Amelia?" Sebastian sighed, rubbing his face. "I don't know what will happen to Amelia. But yes, Mom, I'm going to fight for Lucas. And if you try to interfere," and Margot interrupted him, her voice growing colder. "You think you're in control, but you're not. I'm going to protect this family, even if you don't." Sebastian didn't reply. He knew that anything he said would only fuel his mother's machinations. The thought of losing Amelia ate away at Sebastian like acid. Her words echoed in his mind. "I don't know who you are." It was true he barely recognized himself in the chaos that had taken over his life, but he knew he couldn't just give up. Amelia was the love of his life, and Lucas was his son. Somehow he would have to put these broken pieces back together. That morning, as the city pulsed with its frenetic routine, Sebastian made a decision. He would not let anyone else decide his fate. Margot and her manipulations could wait. Now he had to face Elizabeth again and, more importantly, get closer to Lucas. Meeting Elizabeth and Lucas. Elizabeth lived in a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn, far from the glitz and chaos of Manhattan. When Sebastian arrived, her heart felt like it wanted to escape from her chest. He parked the car on the street and stared for a moment at the door of the simple but welcoming house. Lucas was playing in the yard, kicking a ball while mumbling something that only he understood. Sebastian stood still, watching the boy. It was surreal. The boy running around carefree was in fact his son. There was something incredibly familiar about his movements, the way he frowned when the ball got away. Elizabeth opened the door and stopped at the top of the stairs. She didn't seem surprised to see him. She had probably expected him to come. Crossing her arms, she descended slowly, stopping at the gate. "Sebastian," she began, her voice neutral. "What are you doing here?" He took a deep breath, trying to gather his words. "I needed to see you." "You saw enough at the wedding," she retorted, but her tone wasn't as sharp as before. He gestured towards Lucas, who was now sitting on the grass, playing with a small superhero figurine. "Elizabeth, I can't just ignore this. I want to know him. I want to be part of his life." She looked at her son, then back at Sebastian. For a moment her face softened, but then the firmness returned. "I'm not going to stop you meeting Lucas, but it has to be done carefully. He's just a child, Sebastian. He doesn't understand any of this." "I know," he replied, his voice full of emotion, "and that's why I need to start now. I don't want him to grow up not knowing who I am." Elizabeth hesitated, but finally gave in with a slight nod. "Right, but don't make promises you can't keep." Sebastian nodded, promising himself that he would never fail Lucas. He took a few steps into the yard, and Lucas looked at him curiously. "Hi," said Sebastian, sitting down on the grass at a respectful distance. Lucas frowned, holding his figurine tightly. "Hi," Sebastian smiled. "Do you like superheroes?" The boy nodded slowly, still studying the man in front of him. "This one's the strongest," he said, lifting the toy. "Oh yeah? He does look strong." Sebastian leaned over slightly to get a better look. "When I was your age, my favorite superhero was Captain Solaris. Have you ever heard of him?" Lucas shook his head. "No." "Is he any good?" "He's amazing," Sebastian replied enthusiastically, watching the boy's interest grow. Elizabeth watched from afar, her arms crossed, her heart divided. Watching Lucas interact with Sebastian was both comforting and frightening. She knew it was inevitable, but the fear of Lucas getting hurt still consumed her. After a few minutes of conversation, Lucas began to loosen up. He showed Sebastian his toys, told him stories about school, and even laughed when Sebastian made a silly joke. It was a start, and for Sebastian that was all he needed. Sebastian didn't take long to go after Amelia. He knew he had to be honest, even if it meant exposing his faults in a painful way. He found her in the hotel where she was still staying, this time in a small, private lounge. Amelia was sitting, a cup of tea in her hands, her gaze distant. "So you came," she said when he approached, no emotion in her voice. "I had to come," he replied, taking a seat opposite her. "Amelia, I know things seem impossible right now, but I need you to listen to me." She put her cup down on the table, crossing her hands over her lap. "All right, I'm listening." Sebastian took a deep breath. "I was a coward in the past. I left Elizabeth because I thought I needed to focus on my career. And yes, it was the most selfish decision I've ever made. But I swear, Amelia, I didn't know about Lucas. If I had, my life would have been completely different." She stared at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of pain and love. "And now? What are you going to do?" "I'm going to do what I should have done from the start," he said firmly. I'm going to be a father to Lucas. I'm going to be there for him always. But that doesn't change how I feel about you, Amelia. I love you, and none of this will change that." Amelia looked away, her emotions running high. "Sebastian, I love you too, but this is too much to handle. I grew up in a close-knit family, with parents who showed me that love and dedication are everything. How can I be part of that without taking away from Lucas something he deserves?" "You don't have to choose, Amelia," he said, leaning towards her. "We can do this together. We can be a family." She laughed, but there was no joy in her voice. "It sounds so simple when you say it like that, but it's not. I don't know if I can, Sebastian. I don't know if I have the strength to face all this." Sebastian held her hand, his voice low and full of emotion. "You're the strongest person I know, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to prove that I can be the man you deserve. Just don't give up on me." The tears finally escaped Amelia's eyes. She pulled her hand back, but not in anger. It was the gesture of someone trying to maintain control. "I need time, Sebastian," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to think about what's best for me, for you, for Lucas, for all of us." He nodded, although his heart was breaking. "I understand, and I hope. For you, Amelia, I'll wait as long as it takes." The light rain falling on New York seemed to turn the city into a melancholy movie set, with wet streets and the sound of cars sloshing through the accumulated water. Sebastian stared out of his office window, lost in thought as the cup of coffee grew cold in his hand. Since the moment Lucas had asked him if he was his father, Sebastian's world had become unrecognizable. He knew he had to make decisions that would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone around him. Sebastian knew he couldn't waste any time. He needed to get closer to Lucas, to strengthen the bridge he had started to build the day before. But that also meant facing Elizabeth again, the woman he had abandoned, who was now the guardian of everything he should have protected. Amelia, on the other hand, was a different matter. She was his future, the love he had chosen, and her heart was broken. He needed to mend it, even if he didn't know how. Margot interrupted his thoughts when she entered his office without even knocking. She looked even more serious than usual, her gaze full of reproach. "You're making a big mistake, Sebastian," she began, her voice laden with calculated coldness. He sighed and put his cup on the table without turning to her. "If you've come to tell me what to do, I can save you the effort. I've already decided." "You've decided to ruin yourself?" Margot snapped. "That child and that woman will destroy everything. Amelia has been humiliated in front of everyone, and now you want to embrace this scandal as if it were a badge of honor?" Sebastian finally turned, his gaze hard. "I'm not going to ignore my son, Mother. No matter what you think, or what it costs. He's part of me, and I won't make the same mistake twice." Margot narrowed her eyes. "You're acting like it's noble, but the truth is that you're throwing away everything we've built because of a mistake from the past." "It's not a mistake," Sebastian replied, his voice firm. "And if you can't understand that, then perhaps it's best that you don't get involved." Margot was silent for a moment, her words not finding the desired impact. Finally, she turned and left the office, but not before throwing him a look that promised retaliation. Later, Sebastian called Elizabeth. His voice was calm, but there was a tension that she recognized immediately. He asked to see her and Lucas, suggesting a walk. She hesitated for a moment before agreeing. Although she was still suspicious of Sebastian's intentions, she knew that Lucas deserved the opportunity to meet him. They met in a park in the center of Manhattan, a quiet place, full of life. Lucas immediately ran to the carousel, his eyes shining with the innocent excitement of a child. Elizabeth and Sebastian watched him from afar, keeping a respectful distance from each other as they walked side by side. Elizabeth finally broke the silence, her voice soft but direct. "He liked you." Sebastian looked at her, surprised. "You think so?" She nodded, a discreet smile appearing on her lips. "Last night, he wouldn't stop talking about you before bed. He's shy, so that's rare." Sebastian felt something inside him warm up. "That means a lot to me. More than you know." Elizabeth stopped walking, turning to face him. "Sebastian, I want Lucas to have a father, but that means you have to be consistent. You can't show up and then disappear again." "I'm not going to disappear," he replied, his voice laden with sincerity. "I did that before, and it was the biggest mistake of my life. Never again." Elizabeth studied him for a moment before nodding. She knew Sebastian's words sounded genuine, But time would tell if he could live up to them. As Lucas ran back to them, holding a balloon he had won in the park, Sebastian bent down to speak to him. "Did you have fun, champ?" Lucas nodded enthusiastically, smiling. "Will you play with me again sometime?" Sebastian felt a lump in his throat, but managed to smile. "Of course. Whenever you want." Elizabeth watched the interaction, her heart divided. There was something comforting about seeing Lucas so happy, but she still feared what it might mean for the future. Across town, Amelia was sitting in the living room of her house, holding a photo of her and Sebastian. The memories of how it all began were sweet, but now they were tainted by pain and doubt. Her sister Grace was by her side, listening as Amelia talked about her dilemma. "I love him, Grace," she said, her voice trembling, "but this is bigger than me. Lucas needs a father, and I don't want to be the reason he doesn't have one." Grace held her hand, trying to comfort her. "Amelia, you always think of others before yourself. But have you ever thought that maybe your presence could be exactly what Lucas needs? Not as a replacement for his mother, but as someone who loves him too." Amelia shook her head, tears running down her cheeks. "I don't know. It all seems so confusing." 2 days later, Sebastian went to Amelia's house. He knew he needed to be honest with her, even if it meant facing his pain again. She welcomed him into her living room, looking calm, but he knew that this masked the whirlwind of emotions she was feeling. "I know I hurt you," he began, his voice full of regret. "But I need you to know that my love for you hasn't changed. You're the best thing that's ever happened in my life, and I don't want to lose you." Amelia looked at him, her eyes shining with restrained tears. "Sebastian, I love you too, but this isn't about us now. It's about Lucas. He deserves to have a father present, and I don't know if I can be part of that without taking something away from him." "You're not going to take anything away from him," he insisted, stepping closer to her. "You're one of the kindest and most generous people I've ever met. If there's anyone who can help create a loving environment for him, it's you." The tears finally escaped Amelia's eyes. She looked away, trying to keep control. "I need time. I need to think about what's right for everyone." Sebastian nodded, although it destroyed him inside. "I'll wait, Amelia. For you, I'll wait as long as it takes." She didn't reply, just turned to the window, looking out at the rain falling. As he left behind a woman torn between her love for him and her desire to do what was right for Lucas. Saturday began with a discreet gleam of sunshine among the clouds, promising a pleasant day out. Elizabeth was packing Lucas's backpack while he ran around the living room, excited about the outing Sebastian had suggested. It was the first time the three of them would be going on a longer outing together, away from the playground they usually went to, and Elizabeth couldn't deny that she was nervous. Although she still didn't completely trust Sebastian, and that was why she went along on the outings, something in his eyes over the last few days had awakened a spark of hope. Sebastian arrived at her house on time, wearing a warm smile and a casual shirt that contrasted with his usual impeccable suit. Lucas ran up to him immediately, holding his hand with the characteristic excitement of a child. "Where are we going first?" Lucas asked, his eyes twinkling. "How about the mall?" Sebastian suggested, bending down so that he was at the boy's height. "We can have lunch there and then take a look at the toys and buy some for you." Lucas jumped for joy, and Elizabeth smiled discreetly as she saw the growing connection between the two of them. Despite everything, she was beginning to believe that Sebastian was genuinely trying to be a present figure in his son's life. At the mall, the trio attracted stares. Sebastian was a man who exuded presence, and Elizabeth, with her serene beauty, matched him and Lucas perfectly. They looked like a family. Sebastian led Lucas patiently as he ran from one side to the other, enchanted by the toys and shop windows. Elizabeth watched closely, smiling with every interaction, but keeping a certain reserve, as if afraid to allow herself to relax completely. On the other side of the mall, Amelia was walking with Grace. She had suggested the walk as a way to unwind, but her mind was far away. As she looked at the shop windows without actually seeing them, a familiar sound caught her attention. She stopped and looked in the direction of the sound, her heart beating faster as she spotted Sebastian. He was kneeling next to Lucas in front of a toy store, holding something in his hands as he explained something to the boy. The smile on Lucas's face was infectious, and the way Sebastian looked at him made something inside Amelia ache deeply, but she knew how good that connection was for both of them. Grace noticed her sister's sudden silence and followed her gaze. "Amelia, are you all right?" Amelia didn't answer immediately. She kept looking, and it was then that her eyes landed on Elizabeth. She was standing a few meters away from the two of them, smiling as she watched Sebastian and Lucas interact. There was a tranquility on her face that made Amelia feel a twinge of jealousy. "They look so natural together," Amelia whispered, her voice trembling. Grace frowned. "Amelia, don't jump to conclusions. Sebastian is trying to be a father to Lucas. That doesn't mean he wants to go back to Elizabeth." "But what if he does?" Amelia replied, looking at Grace with tear-filled eyes. "What if they realize they're better together? They have a child. Maybe that's what he should have had all along." Grace held her sister's arm, trying to calm her down. "You're letting your jealousy get the better of you. Think about it, Amelia. Sebastian loves you. He's never said or done anything to give you reason to doubt that." Amelia looked away, taking a deep breath. "What if I'm holding something that isn't mine? What if the right thing to do is to let the two of them raise Lucas as a family? I love Sebastian, but maybe it's better to suffer now, once and for all, than to spend the rest of my life with this jealousy, this doubt." Grace looked at her with concern, but didn't say anything immediately. It was clear that Amelia was struggling with her own feelings, trying to find a solution to a problem that seemed bigger than her. "I need space, Grace," Amelia finally said, her voice determined. "I can't make a decision being so close to all this. I need to leave, to get away from Sebastian, from Lucas, from Elizabeth, from everything." Grace hesitated but finally nodded. "If that's what you think you need, I'll go with you. I won't let you go through this alone." Amelia hugged her, feeling a momentary weight lifted. She didn't know if she was doing the right thing, but she felt she needed some time to find out. That night, Sebastian was at home with Lucas and Elizabeth, reading a book to the boy before putting him to bed. After a day full of laughing and playing, Lucas finally gave in to tiredness and fell asleep with a smile on his face. When Sebastian returned to the living room, he found Elizabeth tidying up Lucas's things. She looked at him with a gentle smile. "He really enjoyed himself today." "Thank you, Sebastian." "I had as much fun as he did," Sebastian replied, taking a seat on the sofa. "Thank you for trusting me to be a part of it." Elizabeth hesitated, but finally said, "I can see you're trying. That means a lot." The two of them looked into each other's eyes deeply. Before he could reply, Sebastian's phone rang. He looked at the number and felt a tightness in his chest. It was Amelia. He answered quickly, getting up and going into another room. "Amelia," he said, his voice full of anticipation. "Sebastian," she began, and he immediately noticed the serious tone in her voice. "Where are you now?" "I'm at Lucas's. I know it's late, but I just put him to bed and I'm on my way out." Amelia felt her chest tighten with jealousy at the thought of Sebastian and Elizabeth together in the house while Lucas was asleep. She definitely didn't want to put up with it, so she said, "I've decided I'm going to spend some time away." He frowned, feeling the ground beneath his feet wobble. "Away? What do you mean?" "Grace and I are going away. I'm going to study in another city, maybe go away for a year. I need space to think, to understand what I really want." "Amelia, you don't have to do that," he replied, desperate. "I love you. No matter what's going on, I love you, and I want to build my life with you." "And I love you too, Sebastian," she said, her voice breaking. "But this isn't just about us, it's about everything. Lucas, Elizabeth, your new life. I don't want to be in the middle of it. I want you to have the chance to discover what's right for you, without the pressure of my presence." Sebastian felt the tears coming, but he fought them back. "You're running away, Amelia, but if that's what you think you need, I won't stop you. Just know that I'll be here. I'll be waiting for you." On the other end of the line, Amelia burst into tears. "Thank you for understanding. I don't know what the future will be like, Sebastian, but you'll always have my heart." When the call ended, Sebastian remained silent, holding the phone as if it were a fragile thread connecting him to Amelia. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to wait for her for as long as it took. Elizabeth could hear the conversation from across the room, but didn't ask anything. Time seemed to have slowed down after Amelia's departure. Sebastian tried to fill his days with meetings, dates with Lucas, and occasional chats with Elizabeth, but nothing seemed enough to fill the void Amelia had left. He found himself thinking of her constantly, of her laugh, of how her eyes sparkled when they talked about the future. Now that future seemed uncertain, a dense fog where he couldn't see the way. Meanwhile, Elizabeth kept her routine focused on Lucas. She watched the growing connection between the boy and Sebastian, but couldn't help the conflicting thoughts that arose in her mind. Despite all the resentment she carried for the past, there were times when she found herself thinking about what could have been. Was fate creating a new opportunity for them, or was she just deluding herself? Lucas, however, seemed oblivious to these dilemmas. He was happier than ever, enjoying every moment he spent with Sebastian. The boy started referring to him as Papa, which always made Sebastian's heart soar. Every time Lucas called him that, Sebastian felt the weight of responsibility and guilt for lost time, but also an indescribable joy. One night, while Lucas was asleep, Sebastian was at Elizabeth's house to discuss planning some future activities for the boy. They were sitting in the living room, a comfortable silence filling the space. Sebastian looked at Elizabeth for a moment, noticing how quiet and tired she looked at the same time. "Are you all right?" he asked, breaking the silence. Elizabeth looked at him, surprised by the question. "Yes, why do you ask?" "You've done so much for Lucas and for me," he said, his voice soft. "I just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself too." She smiled, but there was something in the smile that seemed guarded, almost sad. "I do what I can, Sebastian. Lucas is my priority, always has been, but thank you for caring." Sebastian hesitated, feeling the need to say something more. "Elizabeth, I want you to know that I'm trying to do the right thing. Not just for Lucas, but for you too. I know I've hurt you in the past and that should never have happened." Elizabeth looked away, fiddling with the folds of her blouse. "Sebastian, I've accepted that the past can't be changed. And honestly, you're here now. That's more than I expected. There's nothing left to forgive." Her gaze met his, and for a brief moment time seemed to stand still. The weight of everything they had lived through together was there, between them, unspoken but clearly felt. However, before anything could be said, Lucas called for Elizabeth from the bedroom, interrupting the moment. Meanwhile, Amelia and Grace were miles away, in a new city, adjusting to a new routine. Amelia had enrolled in an art course, something she had always wanted to do but never had the time. Despite being in a new environment full of possibilities, she couldn't help feeling empty and often found herself thinking about her broken marriage. Months later, one evening, as she walked through the city's illuminated streets, she thought about Sebastian. Was he all right? Was Lucas happy? And most importantly, was Elizabeth filling the space she had left? The last question made her heart squeeze. Amelia was enjoying life, but she was always thinking about her past and how everything would be different if Elizabeth hadn't come to her wedding. Grace noticed her sister's silence during dinner that evening and decided to broach the subject. "You're thinking about him again, aren't you?" Amelia sighed, putting down her cutlery. "It's impossible not to. I feel like part of me has stayed there unresolved. It's as if the cycle hasn't really ended with him, with them. It's as if I still had hope. And you think this time away is helping?" Grace asked bluntly. "I don't know," Amelia admitted. "I thought it would give me clarity, but all it's done is make me more confused. I miss him, but I don't know if that's enough. I don't know if love is enough." Grace leaned forward, taking her hand. "Maybe it's time to go back, Amelia. You've given yourself enough time to think. Now maybe it's time to act." In Amelia's absence, the dynamic between Sebastian and Elizabeth continued to evolve. One afternoon, Sebastian took Lucas to a park to play ball. Elizabeth accompanied them, watching from afar as the two laughed and played. At one point, Sebastian looked at her and asked her to join them. She hesitated, but eventually gave in. When they were all playing together, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't felt for a long time: lightness. She couldn't help but smile as Lucas laughed loudly, running between her and Sebastian. For a brief moment, they felt like a family. After the park, the three of them went for ice cream. Lucas was up to his ears in chocolate, and Elizabeth laughed as she tried to wipe him off with a napkin. Sebastian looked at the two of them, a soft smile on his lips. He knew that despite everything, these moments were special. "You've been amazing, Elizabeth," he said, as Lucas ran to the soda machine. "I don't know what I would have done without you. Oh, and I have to tell you something too. You're more beautiful every day." She looked at him with a blush on her face, surprised by the statement, and then said, "I just do what any mother would do, Sebastian. And you're doing great as a father." The compliment caught him off guard, and he smiled. but there was something in his eyes that seemed to say more than his words. Elizabeth noticed, but chose not to say anything. However, Amelia's imminent return hung like a shadow over everyone. She had decided to return after months of absence, feeling that she couldn't live with the doubts she carried. In a short call, she warned Sebastian, who was silent for a long time before answering, "I'm glad you're coming back, Amelia. I miss you every day." That simple sentence made her cry after hanging up. She felt that Sebastian was a little further away, and she knew that his arrival would bring new decisions, but she was prepared to face them. On the evening of his arrival, Amelia went straight home where Grace helped her settle in again. However, she knew she would need to see Sebastian. She needed to confront her feelings as well as his. Meanwhile, Elizabeth felt something change in the air. She knew that Amelia was coming back, and that made her uneasy. For months she had felt a different connection with Sebastian. It wasn't like before, but there was something there. Something she knew could grow, if allowed to. However, Elizabeth also knew that Sebastian's heart still belonged to Amelia. And as much as it hurt to admit it, she knew she had to respect that and move on. Sebastian, on the other hand, was in the middle of an emotional dilemma. He loved Amelia deeply, but the months spent with Lucas and Elizabeth had made him realize the strength of a united family, and how good the moments with Elizabeth were, and how much they recalled the past. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he couldn't put off making decisions for much longer. When Amelia finally called him to ask to meet, he knew that the moment had come. The moment to decide between the love he had always had for Amelia and the new connection he was forming with Elizabeth and Lucas. Sebastian was waiting for Amelia in a quiet restaurant, his fingers drumming nervously on the table as he tried to organize his thoughts. He hadn't seen Amelia for months, and now, with her back, he felt that he would finally have the chance to resume the relationship he had so longed for. Despite everything that had happened, he was sure that the love they felt for each other was strong enough to overcome any obstacle. When Amelia arrived, their eyes met and he smiled, his heart racing. She looked serene, but there was something in her posture that he couldn't decipher. She sat down opposite him, placing her handbag beside her, and for a moment the silence was filled only by the distant sound of cutlery and conversations around them. "You look as beautiful as ever." "I've missed you so much. Is everything all right?" Sebastian asked, his voice heavy with emotion. "I am," she replied, offering a small but restrained smile. "And you?" "I've been waiting for this moment," he said bluntly. "Waiting for you." Amelia looked away for a moment as if she needed to gather her strength. "Sebastian, before anything else, I want you to know that I've been thinking about you a lot too. About us. What we've built and what we could have been." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on hers. "And you believe we can still be all that because I do?" She took a deep breath, the pain evident in her gaze. "I believe that what we feel is real. The love we have is real. But sometimes loving someone isn't enough to make it all work." "Amelia," Sebastian began, but she held up her hand, asking him to let her finish. "I've spent a lot of time thinking, Sebastian. And while I was away, I realized something. I've seen photos of you with Lucas, heard about how happy he is. I saw Elizabeth even from a distance and realized how she was by your side, helping you to become the father Lucas needs. You're creating something together, something I can't replace." Sebastian shook his head, confused and hurt. "You don't have to replace anything. You're part of it too, Amelia. You always will be." She smiled sadly, her eyes full of tears that she struggled to hold back. "But I'm not, Sebastian. I've tried to fit into this future you're building, but the more I think about it, the more I realize that maybe I don't belong there. I know how important it is for you to get closer to Lucas, but I'm not going to pretend to be jealous that you're staying late at the house of someone you once loved." He held her hand, his voice almost a whisper. "Amelia, you're the love of my life. I don't want a future without you." She squeezed his hand back, but the sadness in her eyes said it all. "And I love you too, Sebastian. But true love is also about letting go, about letting those you love find happiness where it really belongs. And I think you belong with Elizabeth and Lucas." Sebastian felt her words like a blow, but he knew deep down that she was being honest with herself and with him. There was a strength in her sacrifice, a courage that made him admire her even more, even as his heart broke. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice almost breaking. She nodded, the tears finally running down her cheeks. I am. And I want you to be happy, Sebastian. All of you. He was silent for a long moment, processing what she had said. Finally, he let go of her hand, knowing he couldn't hold it if she had made that decision. I'll never forget what we had, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Neither will I, Amelia replied, smiling softly. But now it's time for you to move on. And me too. The months that followed were difficult for Sebastian. The conversation with Amelia had left him shaken, but it had also brought unexpected clarity. He spent more time with Lucas, immersing himself in his new routine as a father, and began to see Elizabeth in a new light. She had always been there for him, not as a replacement for Amelia, but as someone who shared something deep and unbreakable: love for Lucas. One night, while Lucas slept, Sebastian and Elizabeth were in the living room of their house, going over the boys' school schedule. The conversation was relaxed, full of occasional laughter, and he realized how comfortable he felt next to her. You know, he said suddenly, interrupting the silence that had followed a laugh, I've never really thanked you for everything you've done for me, for Lucas. Elizabeth looked at him, surprised, but smiled. You don't have to thank me, Sebastian. Lucas is what matters, and I'll always do what's best for him. But you did more than that, he continued, his voice low and full of sincerity. You gave me a second chance at being a father. You gave me strength when I didn't even know I needed it. Elizabeth looked away, visibly moved. Sebastian, you don't have to say that. Yes, I do, he insisted, leaning closer. Because I see you now, Elizabeth. I see how much you mean to me, to Lucas. And I realize that maybe I took too long to see that. She looked at him, her eyes shining with tears. Sebastian, what are you saying? I'm saying that all this time you've been there for me, even when I didn't deserve it. I'm saying that I want to try, Elizabeth, for us, for our family. She was silent for a moment, absorbing his words. Finally, she smiled, shy but genuine. I don't know what to say. Say you'll give me a chance, he replied, holding her hand. Elizabeth took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Sebastian's. And then, with a small smile, she said, Let's just let it happen. The words hung in the air, full of promise and possibility. Sebastian felt a wave of relief and hope when he heard it, but he also knew that he would have to be patient. Elizabeth wasn't just opening a door for him, but for something they had lost years ago, a feeling that, although worn down by time, had never completely disappeared. In the days that followed, their meetings became more frequent. At first, they always revolved around Lucas, trips to the park, school meetings, afternoons at the movies. But Sebastian noticed something new in himself. He wasn't just looking forward to seeing Lucas. He wanted to see Elizabeth, to hear her laugh, to share moments with her. One afternoon, while Lucas played with his friends in the yard, Sebastian stayed in the kitchen, helping Elizabeth prepare dinner. The smell of tomato sauce filled the air as the two of them chopped vegetables side by side. There was a moment when their hands touched as they picked up the same utensil, and they both laughed lightly at the coincidence. Do you remember when we tried to cook together that time? Sebastian asked, his eyes sparkling with the memory. Elizabeth smiled, rolling her eyes. You nearly set the kitchen on fire. I had to pour water on the fire while you tried to save the pot. It was the stove's fault, he replied, laughing. Or maybe the wine. I remember we drank a lot that night. She shook her head, still smiling. I remember that despite the disaster, it was fun. You always knew how to turn anything into an adventure. Sebastian watched her as she spoke, noticing the way her eyes sparkled at the memory. And you always knew how to bring me back down to earth when I lost focus, he said softly. Elizabeth felt her heart race at the intensity in his gaze, but looked away, stirring the pot. Those were good times. And they can be again, Sebastian said, his voice full of sincerity. Every day the connection between them seemed to grow. One evening, Sebastian arrived at Elizabeth's house to pick up Lucas, but found the boy asleep on the sofa, tired from a day full of playing. Elizabeth was sitting in the armchair next to him holding a book. He's had a busy day, she said, smiling as she put the bookmark in the book and closed it. Sebastian sat down on the sofa next to Lucas, looking at the boy with a soft smile. He's growing up so fast. It seems like he'll be a teenager in no time. Elizabeth laughed. And you're going to have to deal with it. Good luck. I hope you'll be around to help me, he said, looking at her with a twinkle in his eye. Elizabeth felt the heat rise to her face, but smiled. "I will be." As he left that evening, he couldn't help but think of the silent house and Elizabeth's absence. There was something about her that attracted him, something that had always been there even when they were apart. One afternoon, while they were walking with Lucas in the park, Sebastian took advantage of a moment of distraction on the boy's part to bring up something that had been stored away in his mind. "Have you ever thought about what everything would be like if we hadn't split up?" he asked, his voice calm but full of meaning. Elizabeth looked at him, surprised by the question. "I have, yes, many times. And what do you feel when you think about it?" She sighed, looking at the horizon where Lucas was running happily. "I feel like we were too young to understand what we had. Maybe we weren't ready." "And now?" he asked, moving a little closer to her. "Now I think we've learned a lot. We've grown up," she said, looking at him. "But I'm still afraid of repeating the same mistakes." Sebastian held her hand, their fingers intertwining gently. "I'm afraid too, Elizabeth. But I think it's worth trying again. Not for Lucas, but for us." She looked at him, and for a moment, everything around her seemed to disappear. She knew he was being sincere, and something inside her, something she had tried to ignore for so long, and there they kissed. Not everyone accepted the new dynamic immediately. Margot, Sebastian's mother, was the first to express her disapproval. When she heard that he was getting close to Elizabeth again, her cold tone made it clear that she didn't approve. "You're making a mistake by going back to the past, Sebastian," she said, over dinner at Harrington Manor. "It's not about going back to the past, Mom," he replied patiently. "It's about building something new with the people who matter." "Elizabeth doesn't belong in our world," Margot insisted. "And Lucas, well, he's just a child. He doesn't understand the impact of these decisions." Sebastian was silent for a moment before replying. "Lucas is my son, and Elizabeth is one of the strongest people I know. They made me see what really matters in life. And with all due respect, Mum, your approval is not what I'm looking for." Margot remained silent, clearly irritated, but over time she softened her stance. "The reason? Lucas." The boy won Margot over with his curiosity, charisma and sweetness, breaking down the barriers she had built up. One evening, while they were playing in the garden of the mansion, Margot finally admitted something that surprised even herself. "You have an amazing son, Sebastian," she said, as she watched Lucas run across the lawn. "He is, isn't he?" Sebastian replied, smiling. "Elizabeth is a good mother," Margot added in a softer voice. "And from what I can see, you two have something special." "Maybe I was too quick to judge." Sebastian looked at his mother, surprised but grateful. "I'm glad you're beginning to see that." The following months brought a new harmony for everyone. Sebastian and Elizabeth continued to build their relationship, not just as parents but as partners. The love that had once seemed lost began to rekindle, one step at a time, until they realized that they were no longer just trying, they were living. Lucas, surrounded by love and stability, blossomed. He didn't need perfection. All he needed was a family that was there for him. And now he had exactly that. That Christmas, as they decorated the tree together, Elizabeth held Sebastian's hand for a moment. He looked at her, and in the midst of the twinkling lights and Luke's laughter, they knew they had found something precious, a second chance at happiness. And now who do you think Sebastian should stay with? Amelia, the great love of his life, who made a sacrifice because she believed Sebastian's happiness lay with Lucas and Elizabeth. Or Elizabeth, the woman who stood by him in his most difficult moments, helping him rebuild his life and creating a bond with him that goes beyond Lucas. Leave your opinions in the comments, and don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to follow the next videos and exciting outcomes. Your opinion matters, and we want to know what you think of this ending full of love, overcoming, and difficult choices. See you in the next video.